Greetings. I'm Brother Judah from the Congregation of Israel, a representative of the NMP, the Nazarene Messianic Party. I am your host today, and we'd like to greet you all who have taken the time to listen in on our podcast, What is to be Done. Here we investigate geopolitical, historical, biblical, social, and other scientific content. Now, we approach the Bible from a social-political perspective, and we argue this is the appropriate way to approach the Bible because the Bible deals with nations and kingdoms and societies, civilizations. In short, it deals with politics and political science. So today, we want to continue a series of discussions that we're having on a debate with Chad O. Jackson and Delano Squires. This debate was held on Jason Whitlock's channel. And most high willing, we will have the link in the description box so you can listen and view the entire debate without interruption. We are critiquing the argument of Chad O. Jackson. And that's where we want to start with, but we're going to pick it up further to a couple of points that we want to address, because ultimately we also want to get to the discussion of the Bible in relation to the civil rights movement and the USSR. And we definitely want to address that. However, I also believe that the background we're giving will help. And one background I want to give today is the background of the Bolsheviks and the connection with A. Philip Randolph. So I want you to pay close attention because Chad O. Jackson is going to mention A. Philip Randolph along with the Soviets. And I also want to discuss today the myth that have been perpetuated, not just in the Black communities or the Latino communities, but all of the communities of the workers. It's ingrained in the institutions, and that's commerce and business. However, commerce and business from the perspective of the African American, I would like to critique and analyze as well using the text Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier. Now let us get into this.
I still have a dream.
And Chad's response is, well, of course he would say that. He's a Marxist.
In fact, he slept with two women who weren't his wife the night before he died.
That one day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution.
That's part of what we do. We air our grievances.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!
Welcome to the Harmony Channel. I am Jason Whitlock, your host. Happy MLK Day to those who celebrate. It is Martin Luther King Jr. Day across America. We wanted to have a special conversation about Dr. King's legacy because it is now being questioned. Is it a force for good, force for bad? Is it necessary? And so I've invited two guys familiar to my audience, Delano Squires and Chad O. Jackson, to have a conversation with me today about MLK, his legacy, his importance to American history. Was he a force for good? Was he for a force for bad? Delano will argue the pro MLK side. Chad, who's got his own documentary on MLK, will argue the anti MLK side. But before we get into this debate, which I'm really looking forward to and hope that you all enjoy, I'm hoping that maybe there will be schools or young people that watch this discussion and learn from this discussion. But before, I'll let these guys introduce themselves, give you a little bit about their qualifications, why they're qualified to participate in this debate, and tell you a little bit about themselves. Delano.
Now, we played this part in the previous discussion, so we're going to go past it, and we're going to get right to Chad O'Jackson's discussion again, because he said a lot, and I wanted to address it a little bit at a time, or should I say, critique it, as I said before, with a fine-tooth comb. And so, in today's session, I want to resume where Chad began to talk about success. We had mentioned this idea of success. He's going to correlate success with business. Also, I would like to address Chad O'Jackson's beginning statements concerning the USSR and Philip A. Randolph. Ultimately, from what I gather from his argument, the USSR and its propaganda campaign used the civil rights movement as a strategic propaganda asset to convey their propaganda, and this propaganda encouraged widespread bitterness, and the bitterness, widespread bitterness among the African American community. And this bitterness was a feel sorry for me bitterness, and this bitterness morphed into the right of entitlement that he argues Black people have today. And I am rebutting these claims as far as the Soviets, A. Philip Randolph, the civil rights movement is concerned. As we stated before, the bitterness was always there from the centuries of oppression by the capitalist class. This bitterness received a platform to give a voice. That platform was the civil rights movement. The Soviets conveyed their ideas, because that's what propaganda means. It just means to convey ideas. Everyone, as we said before, whenever you're defending a point or making a point or trying to convey an idea, it's your propaganda. So the Soviets wanted to use the civil rights movement as a strategic asset to convey their ideas. He used the word infiltration. We're arguing the Soviets didn't infiltrate anything. The Soviets stood in solidarity with the African American, because I stated before, the Soviets themselves, the Soviet people, and the multitude of different races inside of Russia, many were discriminated against and faced Jim Crow. I argue that this point was made by Langston Hughes, and we have left a link to his book, the poet Langston Hughes. We left a link to his book, I Wonder as I Wander, where he traveled through the Soviet Union, and he gave an account of what was going on. He was invited there, actually, like many other so-called black actors and entertainers for the arts and movie and theater. But that's another discussion. But he witnessed the Jim Crow. And the Soviets had grievances, and these grievances were identical to the grievances in which the African American faced. And not only that, these grievances were the grievances in which the entire laboring class faced. And since Chad didn't take the opportunity to give context to the Soviets, we will, Most High willing, today. So we're going to begin with the Soviet aspect in this propaganda campaign and how Chad is presenting it. And then we want to give background. Why? Because Chad O. Jackson, as many others, they continue to convey this myth that the liberty and the freedom or the equitable treatment of all men will be obtained by way of a capitalist system or a system of free market. And this is a myth. Now let us get into this discussion. Again, we're going to begin with Chad bringing in the Soviets and Philip Randolph, and then we want to introduce the background of the Soviets, and then conclude with today's session concerning this idea of success. Why do I want to juxtapose the two? Because I am arguing Chad O. Jackson is demonizing a movement and a socio-economic ideology that will benefit not just African American people, but all people. He's demonizing that and saying it is a detriment, which is true. It is a detriment to his type, the business class, the class of people who are trying to enter into the upper echelon of the capitalist hierarchy. Yes, the Soviets and the Bolsheviks are a threat to that. That's just true. So this capitalist hierarchy and the dogmas of capitalism, which was brought forth out of the feudal aristocracies, they're nothing other than systems of exploitation and the siphoning of the wealth from the masses into the concentration of the bank accounts of the so-called aristocrats or the rich. And this myth of business, which is to solve the problem of the laborers, in particular the African American. This is the myth in which he want to convey. But what will benefit the African American, he is trying to trash. So let us pick this up and see what I have presented thus far is accurate. So we're going to let Chad begin his position. Again, we're looking at Chad O. Jackson, and we're not getting into Delano Squires. We're not looking at his arguments. Our focus is Chad O. Jackson. Okay, so let us begin there.
On race.
Delano, good opening statement. Chad, I do want to, before you go, I want to advise you, you can rebut what Delano says after you give your opening statement. So your opening statement doesn't have to be a direct rebuttal to what Delano said. So let me restate the question. We'll restart the clock here. Was Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement a force for good or a net negative for America in general? and black people in particular?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not a force for good. Really, what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda. The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the civil rights movement in America the strategic propaganda asset.
Just for the record, if the people listening now didn't hear the other discussions, this government expansion, what Chad is causing government or federal expansion, it's his way of describing regulatory authority. Some call it government overreach. Okay, so as we said before, you have to put that in perspective. It was because of federal expansion of regulatory authority in which the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were given. The amendments where women could vote. Okay, child labor laws, minimum wages, overtime pay, occupational safety and health. All this come from regulatory authority, the government regulatory authority, because the capitalists who sit in seats of power, they don't want to do these things if it interferes with profit. So he using federal expansion, signifying government overreach and regulatory authority. But again, these things must be put in perspective. All right. And then he immediately gets into the USSR using the civil rights movement as a strategic propaganda asset. Yes, it was an asset to convey their ideas. Okay. So let him get going again.
The matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not a force for good. Really, what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda. The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the civil rights movement in America the strategic propaganda asset, because that's exactly what they were. When you look at King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a direct line and an indirect line of communication between them and the Soviet Union. This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration, and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization. And by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement, and it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership. I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment to Black Americans and to America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life.
Okay, so he mentioned A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, he handed the baton over to MLK. A. Philip Randolph was pretty much, he's arguing, one of the leaders of the civil rights movements going all the way back to the 30s and 40s. So this A. Philip Randolph, we're going to investigate him. We're going to look into one of his papers or magazines, The Messenger. And we're going to go to the January 1918 issue. And why is because actually this is just months after the revolution that had taken place in the USSR. So again, this association with Philip Randolph and the Bolsheviks, that is what we want to investigate first, okay? First and foremost, that's what we want to look into. So, again, notice the connection. I want Chad just to reiterate it for us so we can look into the references in which he's referencing?
The 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration, and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization, and by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement, and it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership.
Okay. So we're not arguing against that. That's true. The question that need to be asked, or a follow-up, is that bad? The association with the Soviets, is it bad? Now they're going to try to establish the point that the Soviets are bad when they get into the biblical conversation. And that's where we want to go to, because we will also like to compare the Soviets to the biblical teachings. Now, if we go to the Messenger, in the Messenger, this magazine is a magazine that was being printed by Philip Randolph, and under the editorials on page 7, subtitle, The Bolsheviki, he's making reference to the Bolsheviks. This is Philip A. Randolph magazine. And Philip A. Randolph, in his magazine, he has this write-up: the Bolsheviki are in control of Russia at the present. So this is 1917. This is months after the change of power and the fall of the Tsar. Now, Chad O. Jackson speaks of grievances. He speaks of the Soviets bringing forth this spirit of bitterness among the African Americans. Well, the African Americans they already had the spirit of bitterness, being in bondage and also being discriminated against by the capitalist class. It's important for us to stress the capitalist class, because it is misleading to say white people. As we tell you all the time, not all slave owners were white. You had so-called Indian slave owners, light Indians and dark Indians. You had black slave owners. And the argument that the majority of slave owners were white, okay, but the majority of white people did not own slaves. So you can't just throw white people in this. But this is all a part of the confusion and the division by the capitalist class. So we want to put things in order. The capitalist class have discriminated against the African Americans, or the former slaves, and the former indentures, and the indigenous people of the land. All right. So God willing, we will have more discussions on that. So they did have a grievance. The Bolsheviks had a grievance too. So Philip A. Randolph, in his magazine here, he's arguing Russia is in control at the present of the Bolsheviks. Now, we continue. They, speaking of the Bolsheviks, they represent the extreme radicals, not in the sense of being unreasonably extreme in their demands, but in the sense of being unwilling to take a half loaf when they are entitled to a whole loaf. They have sounded the tocsin of farewell. They have sounded the tocsin of farewell the death knell of half pay to the workers of Russia. They demand that the land which the workers till and mine with their toil shall be owned and operated by the workers for the welfare of the workers. Now, somebody had left a comment, and it's to the point where if somebody is leaving ridiculous comments to me, and I give people the benefit of the doubt, but it's to the point where you're not even listening. Either you leaving comments trying to justify your position, or you just ignorant, or probably even worse, stupidity have set in. So I can only make that determination as I dialogue further with people. So someone had left a comment asking about the Bolsheviks and the Russians coveting the oppressor by wanting the oppressor goods. And this person have been probably on our channel for years. And if that's the conclusion you coming up with, you need to just stop visiting our channel, because obviously what we saying is going in one ear and out the other, unless you're struggling with comprehension. Now, the Bolsheviks isn't coveting anyone's goods. They're arguing that they're being robbed and they want their complete hire, just like the Bible say. The covetous one, just like the Bible teaches, is the one who gained his riches from the backs of another, who desire the goods of another. When the children of Israel left Egypt, they didn't covet. God wasn't justifying a covetous practice of saying, demand of the Egyptians silver and gold and resources. I know your King James says borrow, but if you look the word borrow up, it goes from ask to demand. We argue demand is because that's exactly what Jesus demanded of the rich man, the rich ruler, the ruler who gained his wealth off the labor of others. Job companion Zophar explained this science. He said it's a knowledge of old, of the one who accumulated riches. It's an old knowledge that all of the riches in which he have gained, he shall vomit them up again, and they will be given back to whom he have taken them. Okay? So the Bolsheviks isn't the covetous here. They're arguing that they're sounding the alarm bell because they demand that the land which the workers work and till, the land in which they mine with their toil, shall be owned and operated by the workers for the welfare of the workers. That's justice. So Philip A. Randolph is bringing this position. The Bolsheviks, this is what they're demanding. They're demanding justice. Now, he says the leaders of the Bolshevik are Lenin and Trotsky, misrepresented here by the metropolitan press as German agents. This, of course, is simply malicious libel. And this is what Chad O. Jackson is bringing out. Malicious libel. Probably not intentionally, it's just probably what he was taught. So Philip A. Randolph, it is true. He is in solidarity with the USSR, and the USSR is in solidarity with Philip A. Randolph. This is true. Why? Because now they're unwilling to take half the loaf when they are entitled to the whole loaf. This is the same argument that Frederick Douglass had during the Reconstruction. This is the same argument that Thaddeus Stevens, the House of Representative, one of the congressmen, and many others, this is the argument in which they had. They labored in the fields. They toiled in the fields. They have ownership in the fields. So let us distribute ownership of land, resources. All right? So the Bolsheviks had a legitimate grievance. And this libel, defamatory misrepresentation of the Bolsheviks leads into this defamatory libel and misrepresentation of the civil rights movement. The mistake is to bring in the Bible for those who are arguing pro-capitalist, because the Bible is going to bear witness against Chattel Jackson. Now, look at the connection. We see Philip A. Randolph and his connection. So this is true. The Bolsheviks are arguing that they have been robbed. Now, this is 1917. The article that I read was January of 1917. So this is this connection with Philip A. Randolph, okay? This was the connection with Philip A. Randolph and the Bolsheviks. So let us refresh this here so we can move forward with the Bolsheviks.
The 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration, and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization. And by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement, and it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership. I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment to Black Americans and to America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful.
Okay. So again, the conventional means in which his grandparents and others undertook to be successful, we're going to find out he's making reference to business. And we address this idea of business. We're going to follow up with it, but just for the record, yes. This idea of business, it takes us right back to these conventional means held by these businessmen, Black businessmen, who have, as we argued before, internalized the oppressor. And so the conventional means, according to Hammer and Hole by Robin D. Kelly, as a brief statement, Black businessmen and religious leaders made their fortunes from a consumer base of working class Blacks. Nevertheless, the last sentence argues, like the white elite, they maintain, that is the Black businessmen who made their fortunes, they maintain their own exclusive social clubs and rarely interacted with poor Blacks. So they thoroughly internalized the oppressor and his ways. The conventional means was to make fortunes off the backs of the working class. As A. Philip Randolph argued, the Bolsheviks went through the same thing, and now the Bolsheviks are unwilling to take half loaf when they are entitled to the entire loaf. Why are they entitled to the entire loaf? the same reason why the children of Israel was entitled to the riches of Egypt. Because they made the loaf. They tilled the ground, they planted the seed, they reaped the harvest, and they made the bread. And so when we're looking at these conventional means, the conventional means is robbery. And so this Soviet influence really isn't necessarily a Soviet influence. It's the Soviets acknowledging and addressing the injustice and the corruption that the so-called African American has faced, and now they're willing to do something about it, whether they have organized the National Negro Congress or whether they're organizing the civil rights movement. It's time for the masses who've been exploited to do something about their oppressors, whether their oppressors are white, whether their oppressors are black, Asian, Latino, whatever they are. Casting off the oppressor. Now, let us give a history on the Bolshevik, though. Let us give a history on the Bolshevik. Let us go back to Chad as he was explaining about these conventional means. And now we want to pick up this little history on the Bolsheviks.
I still have a dream.
And Chad's response is, well, of course you would say that. He's a Marxist.
In fact, he slept with two women.
So let us see what else Chad is going to add to this here. Philip A. Randolph, being the leader of the National Negro Congress, passed the baton to Martin Luther King and this Soviet connection. Why would the Soviets stand in solidarity? We're going to look at why. We're going to go to 1903 to the rural poor and review a few grievances by the Bolsheviks. You see, somebody got to plead their cause. If they're wrong, they're wrong. Okay? But a lot of the working people, if not the majority of the working people, whether they're willing to participate or not, they should be able to relate. Especially for those of us who are in America and we're familiar with the revolution that took place when the leaders of the colonies broke loose from the crown. No taxation without representation. Okay. So notice what Chad says next.
Into America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful.
Okay, yeah, those conventional means that many took was to take the wealth from the laborers. And that discussion itself is another discussion to get into so we can look at it scientifically. But let's go to 1903. To the rural poor, part 1, the struggle for the urban workers. So let them state their grievance. The workers say, millions of workers. Lenin is arguing, the workers say, we, millions of working people, have bent our backs long enough. We have worked for the rich and remained paupers long enough. We have allowed them to rob us long enough. We want to unite in unions, to unite all the workers in one big union. a workers' party and to strive jointly for a better life. We want to achieve a new and better order of society. In this new and better society, there must be neither rich nor poor. All will have to work. Not a handful of rich people, but all the working people must enjoy the fruits of their common labor. Machines and other improvements must serve to ease the work of all and not to enable a few to grow rich at the expense of millions and tens of millions. This new and better society is called socialist society. The teachings about this society are called socialism. The workers' unions, which fight for this better order of society, are called social democratic parties. So this is their grievance. They have labored and been robbed. They have worked and worked, but still are not receiving equitable distribution of the fruits of their labor. What did the government have to say about this in 1903? According to this record, the government persecutes that party. Why? Because this party is opposed, antithetical, as Chad says. This party is antithetical to the conventional means in which the rich accumulated their wealth. This party, which is seeking justice for the workers, this party is downright hostile to the injustices of the rich. So the government persecutes that party. Going back into the record, 1903, the rural poor, under the struggle of the urban workers. The government persecutes that party. But it exists in secret despite all prohibitions. It publishes its newspapers and pamphlets and organizes secret unions. The workers not only meet in secret, but come out into the streets in crowds and unfurl their banners bearing the inscription, "Long live the 8-hour day. Long live freedom. Long live socialism." Now, in 1903, they were fighting for an 8-hour workday here in the Soviet Union, or there in the Soviet Union. And look what happened in America. They labored towards an 8-hour workday. Work days used to be as long as 15 and 17 hours. Workers fought to bring the workday down to 10 hours. They further fought to bring the workday down to 8 hours. And guess what Chad will call this? Chad will call this federal expansion. 8-hour workday is a regulatory authority implementing how long a worker can work. A day off, overtime pay. So back then, they had a legitimate grievance. They said, "Long live an 8-hour workday." However, when they wanted an 8-hour workday, what was the government's reply? The government savagely persecutes the workers for this and even send troops to shoot down the workers. Sound familiar? Guns, water hoses, dogs, strike breaking, shooting into the crowds of strikers. Sound familiar? Are these legitimate grievances? Are these the grievances that happened in America? Yes. So the Soviets stood in solidarity with this. They didn't just stand in solidarity with black people. They stood in solidarity with all oppressed people. Why? Because they experienced the same thing. This 1903. But the workers do not yield. They continue to fight. They say neither persecution, prison, deportation, penal servitude, nor death can frighten us. Our cause is a just one. We are fighting for the freedom and the happiness of all who work. We are fighting to free tens and hundreds of millions of people from abuse of power, oppression, and poverty. We shall win despite all persecution. So this is what the Soviets and the Bolsheviks were saying. So when they seen the Negro fighting the same fight, they stood in solidarity. When A. Philip Randolph noticed the connection, the same struggle against the same class, he reached out his hand and accepted the solidarity of the Bolsheviks. You see, the Bolsheviks threatened the class in whom Chad represents. But I want to show you something else before we go further with this success idea. The Bolsheviks had another problem. They also argued in Section 2, what do the Social Democrats want? They wanted political liberty. They wanted political freedom. Now, it says, but neither the Russian workers nor the Russian people as a whole are yet free to arrange their public affairs. The people as a whole are the serfs of the government officials, just as the peasants were the serfs of landlords. The Russian people have no right to choose their officials, no right to elect representatives to legislate for the whole country. Is that what the Negro was facing? He didn't have a right to vote. He didn't have a right to choose his officials. He didn't have a right to choose representatives that will legislate the country in which he lived in. In 1903, this is what the Bolsheviks were fighting for. And so they seen Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King fighting for the same thing, which they were continuing the fight. That is, Martin Luther King and Philip Randolph, they were continuing the fight from the Reconstruction. So they joined in solidarity. They didn't have a right to choose political officials. The Russian people still lack political liberty. Political liberty means the freedom of the people to arrange their public state of affairs. Political liberty means the right of the people to elect their representatives, deputies, to a state Duma or a parliament. Political liberty means the right of the people themselves to choose all their officials, arrange all kinds of meetings for the discussions of all state affairs, and publish whatever papers and books they please without having to ask permission. So they wanted freedom of the press as well. Political liberty and freedom of the press. If you're going to tax them, if you're going to take their wages, then so the Soviets were arguing as well. No taxation without representation. They wanted to be able to choose their officials that will represent them. And the Soviets seen that a lot of the American people, the masses of the American people, also was fighting for the same thing. So they joined in solidarity. Why don't Chad bring out the Soviets? Why is it that Chad agrees with the Ku Klux Klan? Why is that? And we find even the Ku Klux Klan arguing the communists are only trying to get Negroes in trouble. Alabama is a good place for good Negroes to live in, but it is a bad place for Negroes who believe in social equality. So the Klan is showing us that that's exactly what the Soviets is fighting for and helping the Negro fight for, is social equality. That is what they were fighting for in 1903 and many other years before the revolution of 1917, where Philip A. Randolph said, the Bolshevik has taken the land. This is the fear of the businessman. This is the fear of those who stand on systemic theft and robbery. This is the fear of the New Age slave owner, the capitalist businessman. He feared losing power over his wage slaves. Political liberty. This is what the Social Democrats want first and foremost, according to Lenin in the Rural Poor, Section 2. What do the Social Democrats want? That is what the Social Democrats want first and foremost. Political liberty. That is the meaning of their first demand, the demand for political liberty. Political liberty will not at once deliver the working people from poverty. It won't all happen at once. But it will give the workers a weapon with which to fight poverty. There is no other means, and there can be no other means of fighting poverty except the unity of the workers themselves. But millions of people cannot unite unless there is political liberty. So they were fighting for 8-hour work days. We continue to read the document. They were fighting for child labor laws. They were fighting for political liberty. They were fighting for freedom of the press. They was fighting for the right to assemble, because they had to assemble in secret. If they got caught by the police, they could be killed, brutalized, thrown in prison, or sent to Siberia. Sound like they were fighting for what all of the struggling masses in America were fighting for. So their spirit of bitterness, and that Chad speaks of, is warranted. Soviets seen the same struggles among the Negroes, so they joined in solidarity. That's what they seen. And it's a shame that Chad left that out. Well, granted, he don't have enough time. All right, maybe it warrants another discussion. All right, so God willing, we'll follow up more with the Soviets and their demands and their grievances. And especially when it comes down to the biblical narrative, we're going to show you, if you were to get a copy of this work, this pamphlet, To the Rural Poor, and read it through, and you're familiar with the Bible, you will have scriptures upon scriptures written down. And I would like to demonstrate it as we go through this article, God willing, in the future. But let us go back to Chad. Now, this is what the Soviets were arguing, the Bolsheviks were arguing, but it was something else going on too that Chad had brought out about success in business. So let us get back to Chad, and we're going to look at this here. He's trying to turn us away from the struggle for liberty and equity and justice for all men, and he want to serve us a platter with business as the primary meal. So let us investigate that.
I still have a dream.
And Chad's response is, well, of course.
Let's get right to Chad's response. Let's get to his response and business. I want to listen carefully as he begin to incorporate. He's going to, we had made mention of success. He mentioned success. And so now we're going to make this connection where he's going to argue the success he's making reference to, the undergirding of this success is business. And let's see if this bourgeois libel of Chad O. Jackson against the civil rights movement is legitimate. All right, so let him walk into his success argument. What he argued is success.
Into America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful. Whether you're talking about in rural Arkansas, whether you're talking about in rural Oklahoma, where my folks are from, or in Texas, where I live now. When you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s.
Now, again, we looked at that in the last session and showed, according to the data, there was no upward success of the vast majority of the so-called African Americans. Okay, that's number one. So we looked at that. So we're not going to address that now. But this upward mobility and this success aspect is what we do. That's what we want to get into, all right? That's what we want. So bear with me again.
When you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s. And then as this kind of cultural Marxist rhetoric, this kind of feel sorry for me grievance rhetoric began to take off with the help of the press on the part of the civil rights activists, you saw the spirit of embitterness really enter colored culture, what we now call black culture. And that has had an adverse effect on, again, not only black culture, but also the larger American society. And I'll end by saying this. When you look at the late Nikki Giovanni, who was a poet, a radical Marxist feminist, she said in an interview with James Baldwin that black folks in America, she acknowledged this, black folks in America have always been successful and have always had businesses. People can look this up on YouTube right now.
So did you catch it? Now he's correlating the success with business, more specifically black business. Okay? So that's what we want to look up before we close. We want to read an account out of black bourgeoisie, but that connection with success is important. All right? It is very important that we understand that, so we can make this connection and see whether what Chad O. Jackson is bringing is really beneficial. Is his ideology a detriment to the so-called African American people in America as a whole? Or is it the civil rights movement, the Bolsheviks, Elder Philip Randolph and Elder MLK? So I'm going to let this play again, and we got to investigate this before we close for today's session.
Enter colored culture, what we now call black culture. And that has had an adverse effect on, again, not only black culture, but also the larger American society. And I'll end by saying this. When you look at the late Nikki Giovanni, who was a poet, a radical Marxist feminist, she said in an interview with James Baldwin that black folks in America, she acknowledged this, black folks in America have always been successful and have always had businesses. People can look this up on YouTube right now. she said that, however, my generation, we were not good business people. We were good civil rights people. We decided to become activists. And when you look at the fact that from around her that time to today, you see this kind of widening of the disparities, gaps, and so on and so forth. And you see this kind of embracing this bitterness and the spirit of entitlement that we now have. And you look at what King was saying in the 1960s, along with people like James Baldwin and others, they were really instilling the spirit of bitterness. And this was part of the kind of Soviet propaganda program that they were implementing.
Yeah, the spirit of bitterness, totally ignoring that the so-called African American had bitterness for the centuries that he was on his land fighting for survival. And also others, Asians and Englishmen and Irishmen, indigenous peoples. But this spirit of bitterness, and then it's a slap in the face when he says that it was this feel sorry for me grievance. And yeah, I would definitely just have to disagree with old Chad. But I would like to bring this idea of success. So if we look at Franklin E. Frazier argument, we read a section last session. I want to read it again. This is in his introduction on page 25, Black Bourgeoisie. It says, one of the most striking indications of the unreality of the social world which the black bourgeoisie created is its faith in the importance of Negro business. And this is what Chad O. Jackson is expressing, the importance of Negro business. E. Franklin Frazier is saying this is unreality. One of the most striking indications of the unreality of the social world which the black bourgeoisie created is its faith in the importance of, quote, Negro business, unquote. That is, the business enterprises owned by Negroes and catering to Negro customers. Although these enterprises have little significance, either from the standpoint of the American economy or the economic life of the Negro, a social myth has been created that they provide a solution to the Negro's economic problems. Faith in this social myth and others is perpetuated by the Negro newspapers, which represent the largest and most successful business enterprises established by Negroes. So that's who it's speaking for. That's what the papers represent. And they have pawned this myth off over to the masses, but the masses are not benefiting from no kind of business, whether it's Negro business, whether it's white people business, Latino business, whatever business. The masses do not benefit. So the faith in this social myth and others is perpetuated by the Negro newspapers, which represent the largest and most successful business enterprises established by Negroes. Moreover, the Negro newspapers help to create and maintain the world of make-believe in which Negroes can realize their desires for recognition and status in a capitalist white world. My emphasis is on capitalist. All right. That regards them with contempt and amusement. Yeah, you're just an amusement to the capitalist class. Let me read this section, chapter 7, same text, chapter 7. Negro business, a social myth. This is what Chad is conveying to us. He's demonizing and casting away the movement and the socio-economic ideology that will liberate all men, and he's trying to sell us a bill of goods of the Canaanite Philistine mercantilist ideology. Similar to the leprechaun on the other end of the rainbow. Chapter 7, Negro Business, a Social Myth, page 153. In the first section, we saw that the capital investment represented by Negro business was insignificant from the standpoint of the American economy, and that it provided an exceedingly small amount of employment and income for Negro workers. Here, our purpose is to show how false ideas concerning the importance of Negro business have become a social myth and how this myth has been propagated among Negroes. This social myth has been one of the main elements in the world of, quote, make-believe, which the black bourgeoisie has created to compensate for his feeling of inferiority in a white world dominated by business enterprise. When did this myth first take form? It was formulated, it should be noted, during the last decade of the 19th century when a legal system of racial separation and subordination was inaugurated, and the hope of Negroes to attain equality in American life was crushed. The myth was created by a small group of intellectuals and Negro leaders who accepted racial separation as the inevitable solution of the race problem. From the 1880s on, as Professor Harris has pointed out in his The Negro as Capitalist. Now we're going to stop there for today's session. A social myth. A social myth. This is what we're looking at. The Negro business is insignificant from the standpoint of American economy, and that this Negro business provide an exceedingly small amount of employment and income for Negro workers. Here, the purpose is to show how false ideas concerning the importance of Negro business have become simply a social myth, and how this myth has been propagated among Negroes. And this is the same social myth that Chad O. Jackson is trying to spread, while he demonizes the Bolsheviks in the USSR. And I give him a benefit of the doubt. Maybe he really haven't have performed a diligent study on them. But it is very difficult to study the Bolsheviks when your heart is given to mammon and chrematistics. Very difficult. So with that, we're going to close for today's sessions. And God willing, we will be back with more discussions. I am Brother Judah, and I appreciate you all from taking the time out to tune into our discussion today. Again, we must be mindful of the so-called conventional means in which businessmen have accumulated their wealth. We must be aware that it isn't about race. It's about a class. And one of your same race can have ideals and values that's diametrically opposed to yourself. So we must examine our values, and then we could determine the values that we want to unite with in others. So I thank you all again for tuning in to our discussion on what is to be done. Most High willing, we will follow up with more discussions as we deal with and investigate geopolitical, historical, biblical, social, and other scientific content. Again, I'm your host, Brother Judah, or Brother Yehuda, a representative of the NMP, a member of the Congregation of Israel, and a representative of the Nazarene Messianic Party. I would like to say to all the people who are sincerely searching, May the Most High bless your understanding. And for all of you who have an ear, let them hear.